8-year-old Kieran Whitmore vanished without a trace during what should have been a perfect family afternoon at Thornfield Valley Park, leaving behind only a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich and a red baseball cap floating in the creek. Morning of September 15th, 2009, had dawned crisp and golden in the small town of Millbrook Falls, nestled in the shadow of the Cascadian Mountains. Sarah Whitmore, then 13, remembered every detail of that day with the precision of someone who had replayed it thousands of times in her mind. The way her mother, Elena, had hummed while packing the wicker basket. How her father, Thomas, had checked the weather forecast 3 times before declaring it perfect picnic weather. The excitement in Kieran's voice as he'd insisted on bringing his new sketch pad, the one their grandmother had given him for his birthday just 2 weeks prior. "I'm gonna draw everything," Kieran had announced, his gap-toothed grin spreading across his freckled face. "The mountains, the trees, maybe even a bear if we see one." Elena had laughed, ruffling his auburn hair that caught the morning light like copper wire. "Just promise me you won't go looking for bears, my little artist." The drive to Thornfield Valley took 45 minutes, winding through dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock. Thomas, a geology professor at Millbrook University, had chosen this particular spot for its unique rock formations and the pristine Silverbrook Creek that meandered through the valley. It was remote enough to feel like wilderness, but safe enough for a family outing. Or so they had believed. Sarah had been in one of her typical teenage moods that day, more interested in her newly acquired Nokia phone than family bonding. She remembered sitting on the checkered blanket, texting her best friend Meredith about the upcoming school dance, while Kieran explored the creek's edge with his sketch pad tucked under his arm. "Don't go too far, honey," Elena had called out, her voice carrying across the babbling water. She was arranging sandwiches on paper plates, her movements graceful and deliberate. Elena worked as a nurse at Millbrook General, and her calm efficiency was legendary among her colleagues. Nothing rattled her, which made what happened next all the more devastating. Thomas was examining a particularly interesting granite outcropping about 30 yards from their picnic spot, his field notebook in hand. He'd been documenting the geological features of the area for a research paper he was writing about glacial erosion patterns in the Cascadian Range. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah, even years later, that her father could read the history of rocks spanning millions of years, but couldn't see the danger lurking in those peaceful woods. Kieran had been sitting on a fallen log, his legs swinging. As he sketched the creek, Sarah could see him from where she sat, his small figure hunched over his pad, tongue poking out in concentration, the way it always did when he was drawing. He'd been wearing his favorite red baseball cap, the one with the Seattle Mariners logo that was already too big for his head. "Sarah, can you keep an eye on your brother while I get the drinks from the car?" Elena had asked, keys jingling in her hand. Sarah had mumbled, not looking up from her phone. That single distracted response would haunt her for the rest of her life. Elena had parked about 100 yards away, where the dirt road ended and the hiking trail began. The car was visible from the picnic area, a blue Honda Civic that Thomas had bought used the previous year. The walk there and back should have taken no more than 5 minutes. Sarah's phone had buzzed with another text from Meredith, something about what dress to wear to the dance. She'd been typing a response when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the peaceful afternoon symphony of creek water and rustling leaves. It was a car engine, but not their Honda. This one was deeper, more powerful, like a truck or SUV. She'd looked up from her phone just as the engine sound faded, probably continuing down one of the fire roads that crisscrossed the valley. A forest had returned to its natural quiet, but something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Kieran?" She'd called out, suddenly aware that she couldn't see her brother on his log anymore. The sketch pad was still there, pages fluttering in the breeze. His half-eaten sandwich sat on the log beside it, carefully wrapped in wax paper, the way their mother always did. But Kieran was gone. Kieran! Sarah had shouted. Louder this time, scrambling to her feet. The panic started as a flutter in her chest, like a trapped bird. This isn't funny. Thomas had looked up from his rocks, his weathered face creased with mild concern. What's wrong, sweetheart? I can't find Kieran. The words came out strangled, high-pitched. Sarah had run to the creek's edge, her heart hammering against her ribs. The water was maybe 2 feet deep, crystal clear over a bed of smooth stones. She could see straight to the bottom. No sign of her brother. Elena had appeared from the direction of the car, her arms full of juice boxes and bottled water. What's all the shouting about? Kieran's gone. Sarah's voice cracked. He was right here, and now he's gone. The next few hours had blurred together in a nightmare of searching and shouting and growing dread. Elena had called 911 while Thomas and Sarah combed through the underbrush, calling Kieran's name until their voices went hoarse. The first responders had arrived within 20 minutes. Deputy Marcus Holloway, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, who'd known the Whitmore family for years, followed by a search and rescue team from the county sheriff's office. By nightfall, they'd had over 50 volunteers searching the woods with flashlights and thermal imaging equipment. Search dogs had been brought in from Portland, their handlers optimistic about picking up Kieran's scent. But the trail had gone cold at the creek, as if the 8-year-old boy had simply vanished into thin air. The red baseball cap had been found. 3 days later, snagged on a branch in the creek about a quarter-mile downstream from the picnic area. The sight of it, waterlogged and faded, had broken Elena completely. She'd collapsed in Thomas's arms, her composure finally cracking after 72 hours of holding herself together for the cameras and the search teams and the endless parade of well-meaning neighbors. Detective Ray Castellanos had taken over the case on day 4. He was a 20-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau, brought in specifically for his expertise in missing persons cases. Castellanos was thorough and methodical, interviewing everyone who'd been in the area that day, checking traffic cameras on the highways leading out of Millbrook Falls, following up on every tip that came through the hotline. But leads had dried up quickly. The only potentially significant clue was a report from another family who'd been hiking in the area that morning. They'd seen a dark-colored SUV parked on Forest Service Road 47, about 2 miles from the Whitmore's picnic spot. The vehicle had been empty when they'd passed it around 10 a.m., but it was gone when they'd returned to their car at 3 p.m., despite extensive efforts to trace the vehicle, including checking registration records and traffic cameras. The SUV had never been identified. It became just another dead end in a case that seemed to have nothing but dead ends. The media attention had been intense, but brief. For 2 weeks, Kieran's school photo had been on every local news broadcast, his gap-toothed smile beaming from missing person flyers that were posted on every telephone pole in 3 counties. The story had even made national news briefly, but without new developments, public interest had waned quickly. The Whitmore family had never been the same. Elena had thrown herself into volunteer work with missing children's organizations, becoming a fierce advocate for families going through what she'd experienced. Thomas had taken a leave of absence from the university and spent months wandering the forests around Millbrook Falls, convinced he'd find some clue that everyone else had missed. Sarah had withdrawn into herself, carrying the weight of that single moment of inattention like a stone in her chest. The years that followed had been marked by false hopes and crushing disappointments. There had been reported sightings in Seattle, Portland, even as far away as California. Each one had been investigated thoroughly. Each one had led nowhere. The Whitmore family had aged in dog years. their faces etched with the particular kind of suffering that comes from not knowing. By the time Sarah graduated from high school, she'd made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She was going to find her brother, even if it took her the rest of her life to do it. She'd enrolled at Portland State University to study criminal justice, determined to understand how investigations worked, how people disappeared, how the system that had failed to find Kieran could be beaten. During her college years, Sarah had become obsessed with cold cases. She'd spent countless hours in the university library, poring over police files and news reports, learning about other children who'd vanished without a trace. She'd discovered that Kieran's case wasn't unique. Children disappeared with alarming frequency, and many were never found. But she'd also learned that some cases were solved years, or even decades later, usually through advances in technology, or someone finally coming forward with information. Her professors had been impressed by her dedication, though some had worried about her ability to maintain objectivity. Dr. Amanda Foster, who taught advanced criminal investigation, had taken Sarah under her wing during her senior year. "You have excellent instincts," Dr. Foster had told her during one of their many conversations. "But you need to be careful that your personal investment doesn't cloud your judgment. The best investigators are the ones who can remain emotionally detached." Sarah had nodded politely, but she'd known that emotional detachment was impossible when it came to Kieran. Her brother was her motivation, her driving force, the reason she got up every morning and kept pushing forward when everything in her wanted to give up. After graduation, Sarah had been accepted into the FBI Academy in Quantico. The training had been brutal, physically and emotionally, but she'd graduated in the top 10% of her class. Her specialty was missing persons, with a particular focus on cases involving children. She'd been assigned to the Seattle field office, close enough to home to continue her private investigation into Kieran's disappearance. Agent Sarah Whitmore had built a reputation as a tireless investigator who never gave up on a case. Her colleagues respected her dedication, though some thought she took things too personally. She'd solved dozens of missing person cases over the years, bringing closure to families who'd given up hope. But the one case that mattered most to her remained frustratingly unsolved. The breakthrough had come on a Tuesday in October, 15 years after Kieran's disappearance. Sarah had been working late at the field office, reviewing files for a case involving a missing teenager from Spokane, when her phone had buzzed with a text from her college roommate. Jessica Chon. Jessica was now a successful real estate agent in Portland, specializing in high-end properties in the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. She'd texted Sarah about a new listing she was showing, a sprawling mid-century modern house in the West Hills that belonged to a reclusive art collector named Vincent Aldridge. "You won't believe this place," Jessica had written. "The guy has like 100 paintings, all of kids. Kind of creepy if you ask me, but the art is incredible. Some of them look so real they could be photographs." Sarah had been about to respond with a polite comment about Jessica's interesting clients when her phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo taken inside the house Jessica was showing. The image showed a long hallway lined with paintings, each one depicting a different child. The quality was extraordinary, each face rendered with photographic precision. But it was the painting at the end of the hall that had made Sarah's blood run cold. Even through the slightly blurry phone photo, she could see it clearly. A boy with auburn hair and freckles, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a red baseball cap. The child in the painting was older than Kieran had been when he'd disappeared, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The same green eyes, the same gap-toothed grin, the same way his left ear stuck out, just a little more than his right. Sarah's hands had been shaking as she'd called Jessica back. "That painting at the end of the hall," she'd said without preamble. "I need to know everything about it." "Sarah? What's wrong? You sound upset." The boy in the painting. What can you tell me about him? Jessica had been quiet for a moment. I don't know much. Mr. Aldridge said he's been collecting these pieces for years. They're all originals, painted by the same artist. Why? Do you recognize him? Sarah had closed her eyes, fighting back the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. I think it might be Kieran. The next few hours had been a blur of activity. Sarah had called her supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Patricia Reeves, and explained the situation. Sack Reeves had been skeptical, but agreed to let Sarah follow up on the lead. With backup from the Portland field office, getting a warrant to search Vincent Aldridge's house had been more complicated than Sarah had hoped. The man had no criminal record, and a painting that resembled a missing child wasn't enough for a judge to authorize a search. But Sack Reeves had connections in the Portland Police Bureau, and Detective Castellanos, now nearing retirement, had been willing to help. I never forgot about your brother, Castellanos had told Sarah when she'd called him. That case has haunted me for 15 years. If there's even a chance that painting is connected to Kieran's disappearance, we need to investigate. The approach to Vincent Aldridge had been delicate. Sarah and Detective Castellanos had gone to his house on a Saturday morning, ostensibly to ask about his art collection in connection with an ongoing investigation. They'd been prepared for resistance, but Aldridge had been surprisingly cooperative. Vincent Aldridge was a man in his 60s, tall and thin with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He lived alone in the sprawling house, surrounded by his collection of paintings. The man had made his fortune in tech during the dot-com boom, then had retired early to focus on his passion for art. I've been collecting for over 20 years, Aldridge had explained as he'd led them through his gallery. I have a particular interest in portraiture, especially pieces that capture the innocence of childhood. The paintings were indeed extraordinary. Each one showed a different child, rendered with incredible skill and attention to detail. The ages ranged from about 6 to 12, and the subjects were both boys and girls of various ethnicities. What they all had in common was a certain quality in their eyes, a mixture of sadness and wisdom that seemed unusual for children. Who's the artist? Sarah had asked, trying to keep her voice steady as they'd approached the painting that had caught her attention. His name is Marcus Thorne, Aldridge had replied. He's quite reclusive, lives up in the mountains near a little town called Raven's Hollow. I've been one of his primary patrons for years. Sarah had felt her pulse quicken. Raven's Hollow was less than 50 miles from Millbrook Falls, tucked away in a remote valley that was accessible only by a single winding mountain road. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear completely, where a person could live for years without anyone asking questions. When they'd reached the painting that had started it all, Sarah had to grip the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. It was definitely Kieran, or at least a boy who looked exactly like him. The painting showed him at maybe 10 or 11 years old, his features slightly more mature than they'd been when he'd disappeared, but unmistakably the same child. This one is particularly special, Aldridge had said, oblivious to Sarah's distress. Marcus painted it about 5 years ago. He said the subject was one of his favorites, a boy with an incredible talent for art. Such expressive eyes, don't you think? Sarah had managed to nod, though she'd felt like she was drowning. Do you know anything about the boy in the painting? His name, perhaps? Aldridge had shrugged. Marcus never tells me much about his subjects. He's very protective of their privacy. But he did mention that this particular boy had been with him for several years, that he'd watched him grow up. The implications of those words had hit Sarah like a physical blow. Watched him grow up. That meant Kieran might still be alive, might have been alive all these years while his family had mourned him as dead. Detective Castellanos had taken over the questioning at that point, his years of experience helping him maintain his composure better than Sarah could. He'd asked about Marcus Thorne's background, about how long Aldrich had known him, about whether he'd ever visited the artist's home. "Marcus is very private," Aldrich had explained. "I've never been to his house. He brings the paintings to me, or sometimes we meet at a gallery in Portland. He's been creating this series for over a decade, always children. He has a real gift for capturing their essence." They'd left Aldrich's house with more questions than answers, but with a clear lead to follow. Marcus Thorne, the mysterious artist living in Raven's Hollow, had some connection to children who bore striking resemblances to missing persons. And one of those children looked exactly like Kieran Whitmore Dot, the drive to Raven's Hollow had taken. 2 hours, winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around them like a living thing. Sarah had sat in the passenger seat of Detective Castellanos' unmarked car, her mind racing with possibilities. What if Kieran was still alive? What if he'd been held captive all these years? What if he didn't even remember his real family? The town of Raven's Hollow was smaller than Millbrook Falls, just a handful of buildings clustered around a main street that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. There was a general store, a gas station, a diner that looked like it had seen better days. The locals they'd spoken to had been polite but guarded, the kind of people who minded their own business and expected others to do the same. Marcus Thorne's house had been another 5 miles up a dirt road that seemed to disappear into the wilderness. The property was isolated, surrounded by thick forest and accessible only by the single road they'd driven in on. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to hide from the world. The house itself had been modest, a log cabin-style structure, with large windows and a wraparound porch. But it was the outbuildings that had caught Sarah's attention, several smaller structures that looked like they might be studios or workshops. One of them had smoke coming from its chimney, suggesting it was currently in use. Marcus Thorne had answered the door himself when they'd knocked. He was a man in his 40s, bearded and weathered, with the kind of calloused hands that came from years of physical work. His eyes had been wary when he'd seen their badges, but he'd invited them in without protest. The inside of the house had been sparse but comfortable, with the rustic charm of a mountain retreat. But it was the artwork that had dominated the space. Paintings and sketches covering every available wall, all of them depicting children. The style was consistent with what they'd seen at Aldrich's house. The same photographic realism, the same haunting quality in the subject's eyes. "I understand you're an artist," Detective Castellanos had begun, his tone casual but professional. "We're investigating some missing persons cases, and we think you might be able to help us." Thorne had stiffened slightly, but his voice had remained steady. "I don't know how I could help with something like that." Sarah had pulled out a photo of Kieran from her wallet, the same school picture that had been on all those missing person flyers 15 years ago. "Do you recognize this boy?" Thorne had studied the photo for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "He looks familiar, but I see a lot of children in my work. I paint portraits, commission pieces mostly." "We saw one of your paintings at Vincent Aldrich's house," Sarah had pressed. "A boy with red hair and freckles, wearing a baseball cap. He looked exactly like this child." "Ah, yes." Thorne had nodded slowly. "That was a special piece. The subject was very talented, had a natural ability with art. I painted him several times over the years." "Where is he now?" The question had come out sharper than Sarah had intended, her professional composure cracking slightly. Thorne had hesitated, glancing between Sarah and Detective Castellanos. He's not with me anymore." "What does that mean?" Sarah had demanded. "Where did he go?" "I think," Thorne had said carefully, "that you should speak with Father Gabriel at St. Michael's." St. Michael's had turned out to be a small Catholic church in a town called Millhaven, about 30 miles from Raven's Hollow. The priest, Father Gabriel Rodriguez, was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He'd been expecting them, which suggested that Marcus Thorne had called ahead. "Please, sit down," Father Gabriel had said, gesturing to chairs in his small office. "I understand you're looking for information about some of the children Marcus has helped over the years." "Helped?" Sarah had echoed. "What kind of help?" Father Gabriel had sighed deeply. "Marcus Thorne is a good man who's made some questionable choices in his life. About 15 years ago, he started taking in runaway children, kids who had nowhere else to go. He'd provide them with food, shelter, and in many cases, he'd teach them art. It was his way of giving them purpose, of helping them heal from whatever trauma had brought them to his door." Sarah had felt the world tilt around her. "Are you saying he kidnapped children?" "No, no," Father Gabriel had said quickly. "Nothing like that. These were children who had run away from home, kids who were living on the streets or in dangerous situations. Marcus would find them, or they'd find him, and he'd take them in. He'd give them a safe place to stay while they figured out their next steps." "But why didn't he contact the authorities?" Detective Castellanos had asked. "If these children were missing, their families would be looking for them." Father Gabriel had looked uncomfortable. Marcus had his own reasons for not trusting the system. He'd grown up in foster care, had some bad experiences. He thought he was doing the right thing by helping these kids directly. "What about the boy in the painting?" Sarah had pressed. "The one with red hair and freckles. What happened to him?" "Ah, you must mean Kieran." Father Gabriel had said the name so casually that Sarah had felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "He was with Marcus for several years. Incredibly talented artist, that boy. But he aged out of the program, so to speak. He's living independently now, has his own place." "Where?" The word had come out as barely a whisper. "Portland, Father." Gabriel had replied. "He works at a gallery in the Pearl District. Goes by the name Kieran Thorne now. He took Marcus's last name when he turned 18. He considers Marcus his father." The gallery had been called Luminous Arts, a small but prestigious space in Portland's trendy Pearl District. Sarah had stood outside for 10 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. 15 years of searching, 15 years of hoping and praying and never giving up. And it all came down to walking through a glass door. The young man behind. The reception desk had looked up when she'd entered, and Sarah had felt her knees go weak. It was Kieran, unmistakably Kieran, but grown up. He was 23 now, tall and lean with the same auburn hair and green eyes, though the freckles had faded somewhat. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and had a small scar on his chin that hadn't been there when he was 8. "Can I help you?" He'd asked, his voice polite but distant. There was no recognition in his eyes when he looked at her, no sign that he knew who she was. "I'm looking for Kieran Thorne," Sarah had managed to say. "That's me." He'd smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "Are you interested in any of our current exhibitions?" Sarah had pulled out her badge, her hands shaking slightly. "I'm special. Agent Sarah Whitmore with the FBI. I need to speak with you about your past." Kieran's expression had changed immediately, becoming guarded and wary. "I don't understand. What about my past?" "Your real name is Karen Whitmore," Sarah had said gently. "You disappeared from a family picnic 15 years ago. Your parents. And your sister. Your sister has been looking for you ever since." Kieran had gone very still, his face pale. "I think you're mistaken. My name is Kieran Thorne. I've never been missing. You have a birthmark on your left shoulder," Sarah had continued, her voice breaking slightly. "It's shaped like a crescent moon. You used to say it was where a dragon bit you." Kieran had staggered backward, his hand instinctively going to his shoulder. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I'm your sister, Kieran. I'm Sarah. I've Been looking for you for 15 years. The reunion had been nothing like Sarah had imagined during all those years of hoping. Kieran had been confused, frightened, and deeply suspicious. He'd had no memory of his life before Marcus Thorne, claiming that he'd been told his family had died in a car accident when he was very young. Marcus had been the only father he'd ever known, the man who'd taught him to paint, who'd given him a home and a purpose. "I don't understand," Kieran had said, his voice shaking. "If what you're saying is true, why didn't anyone find me? Why didn't anyone come looking for me?" "We did," Sarah had whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We never stopped looking. We never gave up." The investigation that followed had been complex and heartbreaking. Marcus Thorne had been arrested and charged with kidnapping, though he'd maintained that he'd only been trying to help. According to his story, he'd found Kieran wandering alone in the woods near Raven's Hollow, crying and confused. The boy had claimed he couldn't remember his name or where he'd come from, and Marcus had assumed he was another runaway. "I know I should have called the police," Marcus had admitted during his interrogation. But Kieran was so scared, so traumatized. He didn't want to go to the authorities. He begged me to let him stay, and I didn't have the heart to turn him away. The truth had been more complicated than either version of the story. Medical examinations had revealed that Kieran had suffered a significant head injury sometime around the age of 8, consistent with the timeline of his disappearance. The injury had caused retrograde amnesia, wiping out his memories of his early childhood. Marcus Thorne had found him exactly as he'd claimed, but instead of immediately seeking help, he'd made the decision to keep the boy. "I was trying to protect him," Marcus had insisted. "He was happy with me. He had talent, purpose. I gave him a life." The revelation had been devastating for the Whitmore family. Elena and Thomas had aged dramatically in the years since Kieran's disappearance, and the shock of finding him alive, but with no memory of them, had been almost too much to bear. They'd wanted to bring him home immediately, to rebuild the relationship they'd lost, but Kieran had been reluctant. "I understand that you're my family," he'd told them during their first meeting, "but I don't remember you. Marcus is the only father I've ever known. I can't just forget 15 years of my life." The process of rebuilding their relationship had been slow and painful. Kieran had agreed to regular therapy sessions, hoping to recover some of his lost memories. He'd also agreed to spend time with his biological family, though he'd continued to live independently in Portland. Some memories had started to return gradually. Kieran had begun to remember fragments of his childhood, playing in the backyard with Sarah, helping Elena in the garden, drawing pictures for Thomas to hang on his office wall. But the memories were fuzzy and incomplete, like trying to remember a dream. "I remember you teaching me to skip stones," he'd told Sarah during one of their meetings. "You were so patient, even when I kept throwing them wrong." Sarah had cried. Then, overwhelmed by the flood of memories that single comment had brought back, she'd taught Kieran to skip stones at the very creek where he'd disappeared, just a few weeks before that terrible day. The legal proceedings against Marcus Thorne had been complicated by the unusual circumstances of the case. While he'd technically kidnapped Kieran, his motives had been protective rather than malicious. He'd provided the boy with a loving home, education, and opportunities he might not have had otherwise. The fact that Kieran had no memory of his abduction had also complicated matters. In the end, Marcus had been sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he'd been released after serving only 2 due to good behavior and the testimony of several character witnesses, including Kieran himself. The case had raised difficult questions about the nature of family, the meaning of home, and the sometimes blurry line between rescue and kidnapping. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the psychiatrist who'd been treating Kieran, had explained the complexities of his situation during one of their sessions. Kieran experienced a severe trauma at the age of 8 that erased his memories and essentially created a new personality. The boy who was kidnapped and the young man who was found are, in many ways, different people. The challenge is helping him integrate both identities. For Sarah, the most difficult part had been accepting that her little brother was gone, even though Kieran was standing right in front of her. The 8-year-old boy who loved to draw and dream about bears had been replaced by a thoughtful, artistic young man who saw Marcus Thorne as his father and had no memory of the family who'd never stopped searching for him. "I want to remember," Kieran had told her during one of their therapy sessions. "I want to feel the connection that you obviously feel, but I can't manufacture emotions that aren't there." The breakthrough had come during their 4th month of therapy. Dr. Hayes had suggested a technique called art therapy, encouraging Kieran to express his feelings through drawing and painting. During one session, Kieran had started sketching without really thinking about what he was creating. The drawing that had emerged was startling in its detail and emotion. It showed a young boy sitting by a creek, his face turned up toward the sky with an expression of pure joy. In the background, barely visible, was a figure that looked like Sarah, older and more mature than she'd been at 13. "I remember this," Kieran had whispered, staring at the drawing. "I remember sitting by the water, feeling so happy. And I remember you were there, but you were upset about something. You had that phone in your hands, and you weren't paying attention to me." Sarah had broken down completely then, the weight of 15 years of guilt and grief crashing over her. Like a tsunami. "I'm so sorry," she'd sobbed. "I was supposed to watch you. I was supposed to keep you safe." Kieran had reached out and taken her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "It wasn't your fault, Sarah. You were just a kid, too." The healing process had been long and difficult for everyone involved. Elena and Thomas had struggled with their own feelings of guilt and anger, wondering if they'd failed their son by not finding him sooner. Sarah had continued to blame herself for that moment of inattention that had changed everything. And Kieran had grappled with the challenge of honoring both his past and his present, trying to build relationships with his biological family while maintaining his loyalty to Marcus. The media attention had been intense once the story broke. The case of the missing boy who'd been found after 15 years had captured the public's imagination, leading to countless interviews, documentaries, and book deals. Sarah had declined most of the requests, wanting to protect her family's privacy, but she'd agreed to speak at a few conferences about missing children and the importance of never giving up hope. "Every case is different," she told an audience of law enforcement professionals and victim advocates. "But what I learned from Kieran's disappearance is that families need to be prepared for the possibility that the person they find might not be the same person they lost. Love isn't always enough to bridge that gap, but it's a place to start." 2 years after Kieran's discovery, the Whitmore family had found a new normal. Kieran had agreed to hyphenate his name, becoming Kieran Whitmore Thorne, honoring both his biological family and the man who'd raised him. He developed a close relationship with Sarah, though their bond was more like new friends than siblings who'd grown up together. Elena and Thomas had been more patient, understanding that rebuilding their relationship with their son would take time. They'd started small, with regular dinners and shared activities, slowly creating new memories to replace the ones that had been lost. "I may not remember being your little boy," Kieran had told them during one of their dinners, "but I'd like to learn how to be your adult son." Marcus Thorne had been released from prison and had moved to a small apartment in Portland, close enough to maintain his relationship with Kieran, but far enough away to give the family space to heal. He'd continued to paint, though his subjects had shifted from children to landscapes and still lifes. "I know what I did was wrong," he'd told Sarah during one of their few conversations. I know I should have tried harder to find his family, but I want you to know that I loved him like my own son. I gave him the best life I could. Sarah had struggled with her feelings about Marcus for a long time. Part of her hated him for taking her brother away, for the years of searching and hoping and grieving. But another part of her was grateful that Kieran had been safe and loved, even if it wasn't by his biological family. I can't forgive you for what you took from us, she'd finally told him. But I can acknowledge that you gave him something too. You gave him a life, and for that, I suppose I should be grateful. The case had profound implications for how missing children investigations were conducted. Sarah had worked with the FBI to develop new protocols for cases involving traumatic amnesia, and she'd become a leading expert in the field of recovered missing persons. But the most significant change had been in Sarah herself. For 15 years, she'd defined herself by her search for Kieran, by her guilt over that moment of inattention, by her determination to bring her brother home. With Kieran found, she'd had to rediscover who she was beyond the role of the grieving sister. I spent so many years looking backward, she'd told Dr. Hayes during one of her own therapy sessions. I need to learn how to look forward again. The breakthrough had come during a case Sarah had been working on involving a missing girl from Seattle. 8-year-old Maya Rosenberg had vanished from a playground while her mother had been distracted by a phone call from work. The parallels to Kieran's case had been obvious, and Sarah had thrown herself into the investigation with renewed vigor. 3 weeks into the search, they'd found Maya safe and unharmed, hiding in an abandoned building with a homeless woman who'd been trying to protect her from an abusive stepfather. The reunion between Maya and her mother had been everything that Sarah's reunion with Kieran hadn't been: tears of joy, immediate recognition, a family made whole again. Thank you, Maya's mother Jennifer had whispered to Sarah after they'd found her daughter. Thank you for not giving up. Sarah had smiled, feeling something shift inside her chest. That's what we do. We don't give up. As the years passed, the Whitmore family had continued to evolve and heal. Kieran had become successful as an artist in his own right, his work showing a unique blend of the technical skill Marcus had taught him and an emotional depth that seemed to come from his unique experiences. His paintings often featured themes of loss and recovery, of finding light in darkness. My art is how I process everything that's happened, he'd explained to a journalist writing about his first solo exhibition. I may not remember my childhood, but I can express the emotions that come with trying to piece together a fractured identity. Sarah had eventually transferred to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, where she'd specialized in cases involving long-term missing persons and recovered victims. Her unique perspective as someone who'd lived through both sides of the experience had made her invaluable to families going through similar ordeals. She'd also written a book about the experience, titled Finding Home, a sister's 15-year search for the truth. The proceeds had gone to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the book had become required reading in many criminal justice programs. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been Sarah's relationship with Dr. Michael Brennan, a forensic psychologist she'd met while working on a case involving a recovered kidnapping victim. Michael had understood the complexities of her family situation in a way that few people could, and their professional partnership had gradually evolved into something more personal. You saved me, Sarah had told him on the night he'd proposed, overlooking the same creek where Kieran had disappeared all those years ago. You taught me that I could be more than just the sister who lost her brother. You were never just that, Michael had replied, slipping the ring onto her finger. You were always the sister who never gave up hope. Their wedding had been small and intimate, held in the garden behind Elena and Thomas's house in Millbrook Falls. Kieran had walked Sarah down the aisle, his presence both a symbol of loss and recovery, of the way families could be broken and reformed in unexpected ways. "I may not remember being your little brother," he'd whispered to her as they'd reached the altar, "but I'm honored to be your big brother now." The years that followed had brought new challenges and new joys. Sarah and Michael had had 2 children, a daughter named Elena after Sarah's mother, and a son they'd named Thomas. Kieran had remained a constant presence in their lives, the loving uncle who taught them to draw and told them stories about the importance of family. Elena and Thomas Whitmore had become doting grandparents, finally able to experience the joy of watching children grow up that they'd been denied when Kieran had disappeared. They'd moved to Portland to be closer to their expanded family, selling the house in Millbrook Falls that had been filled with too many painful memories. Marcus Thorne had remained on the periphery of their lives, a complicated figure who represented both loss and salvation. He'd attended Kieran's wedding when he'd married a fellow artist named Rebecca, and he'd been present for the birth of Kieran's children. The relationship between Marcus and the Whitmore family had never been easy, but it had eventually found a kind of uneasy peace. "He's part of our story now," Elena had said when Sarah had asked how she felt about Marcus's continued presence in their lives. "I can't pretend to understand all of his choices, but I can see that he loves Kieran. Sometimes that has to be enough." As Sarah approached her 40th birthday, she'd reflected on the long journey that had brought her family to this point. The 8-year-old boy who disappeared by Silverbrook Creek was gone forever, his memories lost to trauma and time. But the man he'd become was a gift that none of them had expected, a second chance at being a family in a way they'd never imagined possible. The old pain was still there, would always be there, but it had been joined by something new: gratitude for the time they'd been given, appreciation for the bonds they'd been able to forge, and hope for the future they were still building together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Kieran had never disappeared? Michael had asked her one evening as they'd watched their children play in the backyard while Kieran taught them to identify different types of clouds. Sarah had considered the question carefully. "I used to think about that all the time. I used to think that everything would have been perfect if he just stayed by that creek. But now I realize that we might never have become the people we are today. Kieran might never have discovered his artistic talent. I might never have become an FBI agent. We might never have learned how strong we could be when everything fell apart. Do you think it was worth it?" Michael had pressed gently. Sarah had watched Kieran lift their daughter onto his shoulders, both of them laughing as they pointed at a cloud that supposedly looked like a dragon. The sound of their laughter had carried across the yard, mixing with the voices of Elena and Thomas as they prepared dinner in the kitchen. "No," she'd said finally. "Nothing is worth 15 years of not knowing, 15 years of fear and guilt and searching. But I've learned that sometimes we don't get to choose what happens to us. We only get to choose how we respond to it." As the sun had set over their small piece of the world, Sarah had felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. The boy who disappeared during that family picnic so many years ago had finally come home, not as the child they'd lost, but as the man he'd chosen to become. And in the end, perhaps that was the most beautiful kind of homecoming of all. The painting that had started it all still hung in Vincent Aldridge's collection, though he'd offered to donate it to the Whitmore family. They'd declined, preferring to leave it where it was, as a reminder of the unexpected ways that art could bridge the gap between the lost and the found. "It belongs to the world now," Kieran had said when they'd made the decision. "Maybe someday it will help another family find their way back to each other." And so the story that had begun with a disappeared boy and his sister's desperate search had evolved into something richer and more complex, a testament to the resilience of love, the power of hope, and the endless capacity of families to reinvent themselves in the face of unimaginable loss. Detective Ray Castellanos had retired from the Portland Police Bureau a year after Kieran's discovery, his final case bringing the kind of closure that had eluded him for most of his career. He'd stayed in touch with the Whitmore family, becoming something of an honorary grandfather to Sarah's children. 30 years on the force, he'd told Sarah at his retirement party, and your brother's case taught me more about the nature of family than all the others combined. Dr. Amanda Foster, Sarah's old professor, had used the Kieran Whitmore case as the centerpiece of a groundbreaking study on the psychological impact of long-term disappearances on family members. Her research had led to new support systems for families of missing persons and had influenced policy changes in how such cases were handled. Even Jessica Chun, the real estate agent whose casual text message had started the final chapter of the search, had been affected by the outcome. She'd become an advocate for missing children's organizations and had used her professional connections to help raise funds for search and rescue operations. The ripple effects of one family's tragedy and eventual healing had touched countless lives, creating a network of people who understood that sometimes the most profound losses could lead to the most unexpected forms of grace. Father Gabriel Rodriguez had continued his work with Marcus Thorne's informal network of helpers, working to create legitimate resources for runaway and at-risk youth. The program that had begun as one man's misguided attempt to help had evolved into a licensed nonprofit organization that had helped hundreds of children find safe homes and stable futures. Marcus's heart was in the right place, Father Gabriel had explained to a reporter writing about the organization's success. He just went about it the wrong way. But sometimes good can come from even the most flawed intentions. The town of Ravens Hollow had been transformed by the attention the case had brought. What had once been a dying mountain community had found new life as artists and writers, drawn by the story of Marcus Thorne and the mysterious beauty of the isolated valley, had moved to the area. The town had embraced its connection to the story, opening a small museum dedicated to the case and the broader issue of missing children. As for Marcus Thorne himself, he'd found a kind of peace in his later years. His art had taken on new dimensions. After his release from prison, incorporating themes of redemption and the complex nature of love, he'd donated several of his paintings to auction, with the proceeds going to support legitimate programs for missing and exploited children. I can't undo what I did, he'd told a parole officer during one of their final meetings, but I can try to make sure it leads to something positive. The annual Kieran Whitmore Day had become a tradition in Millbrook Falls, a community event focused on child safety and family togetherness. Sarah had been reluctant to have the day named after her brother, but the town had insisted, seeing it as a way to honor both the boy who'd been lost and the man who'd been found. It's not about celebrating what happened to us, Sarah had explained, to a group of families affected by similar tragedies. It's about celebrating the fact that we survived it, that we found our way back to each other, and that we're still here to tell the story. The creek at Thornfield Valley Park had been renamed Kieran's Creek, though the family had mixed feelings about the designation. Thomas had lobbied against it initially, feeling that it turned his son's trauma into a tourist attraction. But as the years had passed, he'd come to see it differently. Maybe it will remind people to pay attention, he'd said during the dedication ceremony. Maybe some other family won't have to go through what we did. Sarah's work with the FBI had taken her around the country, consulting on cases involving recovered missing persons and long-term disappearances. She'd developed protocols that were now used by law enforcement agencies nationwide, and she'd trained hundreds of investigators in the specialized techniques needed for such cases. But her most important work had been with the families themselves, helping them navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges that came with finding a missing loved one after years of absence. The hardest thing for people to understand, she'd explained to training seminar, is that recovery isn't the end of the story. It's actually just the beginning of a new chapter, one that requires just as much strength and resilience as the search itself. Her book had been translated into 12 languages and had become a beacon of hope for families dealing with similar situations around the world. Sarah had received thousands of letters from people sharing their own stories of loss and recovery, of the long journey between despair and acceptance. One letter had particularly moved her, from a mother in Germany whose son had been missing. "For 8 years, your story has given me permission to hope again," the woman had written. "Not hope that everything will be exactly as it was, but hope that love can survive even the most impossible circumstances." As Sarah had read those words, she'd understood that Kieran's disappearance and recovery had become more than just their family's story. It had become a symbol of the enduring power of human connection, of the ways that families could be broken and reformed, of the truth that love sometimes meant accepting people as they were, rather than trying to make them into who they used to be. The painting of the boy with the red baseball cap still hung in Vincent Aldridge's gallery, though it was now accompanied by a small plaque explaining its significance. Visitors would often pause in front of it, struck by the haunting beauty of the piece and the incredible story it represented. "Every time I look at it," Aldridge had told a journalist, "I'm reminded that art has the power to heal as well as to reveal." That painting didn't just capture a moment in time. It became the key that unlocked 15 years of mystery and brought a family back together. And in the end, perhaps that was the most fitting legacy of all. That a simple painting, created by a complicated man who'd made a terrible choice for what he believed were the right reasons, had become the bridge that finally brought Kieran Whitmore home. Not to the childhood he'd lost, but to the future he was still building, one brushstroke at a time. The boy who'd disappeared during a family picnic had grown into a man who understood that home wasn't just a place or a memory. It was something that could be created and recreated, painted and repainted, until it finally captured the truth of who you were and who you chose to become. And sometimes, Sarah had learned, that was the most beautiful kind of homecoming of all.